On behalf of this fellowship, I thank you for your generosity in time, in money, but especially in spirit to be here. A brief reading, and we will have a time hopefully for conversation afterwards, after I do the sermon. This book is by Gilbert Rendell, Behavioral Covenants in Congregations. It's very dry in some ways. It's subtitled A Handbook for Honoring Differences, and it's from the Alban Institute. He talks in the book about two dynamic tensions that are involved in human society, and we'll recognize them. And they're at all levels. One is what he calls the domain of law. If you go out on the highway and you drive 150 miles an hour down the road, you can expect that the law will catch up with you. On the other extreme, there's the domain of free choice. I can drive 150 miles an hour if I damn well want to, so there. In the middle, he says, is what is called the domain of manners and obedience to the unenforceable. Clearly not 150 miles an hour. And what he says is that this dynamic tension between the law and free will go back and forth. And he says, rarely in this ongoing argument between these two dominant domains is the softer voice of manners or moral behavior heard. Yet it is in this middle area of moral behavior and manners that says that behaviors are practiced simply because people know right from wrong in consort together. And he goes on to say, the domain of obedience to the unenforceable is that area in our lives where we act not because we're forced to, domain of law, or because we have the freedom to do whatever we want. But it's a place in between because we understand that it is right to do so, and so we discipline ourselves to do what is right and wise. He says then that congregations are the places where this can arise most fruitfully if we work it well. So let's spend a few moments thinking about what this congregation and your lives, your families, your history as people, where do you stand at one time or another? A domain of law, a domain of free choice, or someplace in between, in your family, in your community, or even here. And then I'll have a few words to say. Well, Paula and Jorge, thank you. As always, welcome back from your trip. And Meg, who I think has gone back to the nursery because it's just habit. And to the new board and the veteran board, and especially to John, who has brought us through so much this last year. Thank you for guiding us. I want to talk a little bit about covenants and healthy relationships this morning. Now, it might seem a little odd because you are generally a very polite and kind congregation. And I've gotten to know you over 16 or 17 or 18 months, and I have proof of it. It's recorded, actually. We are in the close, though, of our interim period together. I started here in July of 2010. I will be leaving this coming July. And we're also, of course, at the beginning of a new year of promises and resolutions and possibilities. Now, when I came here a year and a half ago, I said that there were 5 interim tasks. And this is standard in the work that I and others do. The first task is almost always coming to terms with the past, because that's the first thing that we have to deal with in transition in community. The last one is preparing for the future. So the talk about covenant and good relationship is really tying those two pieces together. We've done a lot of work on the past. Now we're moving forward. So, what is a covenant? Well, the easiest definition is that it is a promise between usually two or more parties. In legal terms, it's understood as a binding contract. Now, covenants, as probably some of us remember, have had a bad reputation in the past. For example, there were neighborhood covenants that were there to keep out undesirables. Such people included blacks, Asians, Jews, Catholics, and anyone else who was not part of the tribe. Other covenants are still a little bit tricky because they're written by homeowners associations that may start out in a very reasonable manner, but then can become very dictatorial in nature. But when you break all that down, covenants are something that we take part in all the time. We promise to show up for work on time. We exchange vows at weddings or ceremonies of union, and we make promises to each other. It's important to note that a covenant, though, is usually involving more than one person. A promise or covenant we make to ourselves isn't usually as powerful as one we make with others. For example, last Sunday we had a service on atonement and using flash paper, which people liked, and made New Year's resolutions. Well, if you make a New Year's resolution in secret, how long is it really going to last? Come on. Those of us, like myself, who struggled with addiction, made promises all the time to ourselves after the hangover or whatever. And those promises don't really work out because shame and guilt drive us back into our addiction. So the most enduring covenants are between people or communities. A president of the United States makes a covenant when he, or eventually she, has an inauguration. When people join the military, they take an oath or vows. Religious communities have covenants as well. The Jewish community of the world has what it understands as a covenant between itself and Yahweh, the Jewish name for God. Buddhist and Christian communities have their own covenants of this is how we will behave together. Even, or especially, the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations has a covenant. It's in your hymnal, and you don't have to look for it now. It says at the very beginning, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. Well, they're not the only ones. You actually have a covenant here too. We read it in unison every Sunday, and I've been very impressed this year about how well you've memorized it. I actually thought it was great that the children had memorized it, but then I discovered that you had as well. It's not a creedal statement, nor is it a statement given to you from on high from the Unitarian Universalist headquarters in Boston. It's actually, originally was in a hymnal that we use as number 473 by James Blake. Now, in case you're wondering what I'm talking about, those of you who might be new, it's very simple. It's in the statement in your bulletin. I'll do the first line. You can do the rest. Love is the spirit of this church.
Service is law. This is our great covenant. Dwell together in peace. Seek the truth in love and help one another.
See? This is our great covenant. It's not a little one or an occasional one, and it's not one that's just valid from Sunday morning from 10:30 until about 11:40. It's supposed to be a covenant that has some power to it. So why do I mention this unison affirmation covenant? Well, you all know it pretty well, and I know you're polite and well-mannered, mostly. The troubled times of 2 years ago and beyond are mostly a fading memory. So as far as I can see, and I'm an outsider here, I can say that you probably use it pretty well as a relational covenant, not a behavioral covenant. but Robin suggested relational, and I think that's a better term. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of what happens when it doesn't go well. And this is going to be from other congregations. I'm not saying where. I'm not saying when. I've been involved with 14 congregations as a layperson and minister. 2 congregations in particular did not have a covenant of how do we get along. One of the congregations had a self-proclaimed matriarch and patriarch who were married to each other. And they were a somewhat elderly couple, and they were very proud of being in an open marriage. They not only were proud of that, but they encouraged others in the congregation to take part in their open marriage, and particularly any woman who came walking in the door was encouraged to take part. As a result, many people did not come back, and it led to much awkwardness. The couple was confronted about this. Their response was, we have inherent worth and dignity, and we can do whatever we want. Second congregation, a young man became involved with a woman, and they split up under very awkward circumstances. Each agreed in writing to avoid church events where the other would be. The man broke that agreement pretty quickly, and there was a restraining order served on him by a local court. The man then started to gather allies in the congregation to demean the woman and her friends. He was confronted about the harm he was causing. His defense was he had the right as an individual to say and do whatever needed to be done to prove that she was wrong and he was right. Both of these situations were resolved over time, but you can imagine how much harm was done before they got resolved. Leadership needed to find a way to set boundaries, and they had to do it during the conflict rather than during a calm time. It was messy. Neither congregation had the means at that time of conflict to resolve it in a way before it became unhealthy for everyone involved. Now, at this point in time, and I'm speaking now institutionally, this fellowship does not have a way to do that as well. The transition team has done informal conflict resolution between myself and several people in this congregation in the last year and a half, and it's worked pretty well, I think. However, I've recommended to the leadership and now to you that we develop ways to flesh out the beautiful words in that unison affirmation. Why? I start with this assumption. We will disagree. Conflicts will happen. People will get upset with each other. You're normal. I said this a year and a half ago. You're normal. It's going to happen. So now is the time, as we're in this transition time, to really begin to say, okay, how do we create a container for resolution of those disagreements? In a reading a few minutes ago, Gil Wendell spoke of those two polarities. One is the rule of law, and the other is the exercise of fervent free will. All that's good. And he tells us that societies and people and communities bounce back and forth all the time. He mentions the abortion debate as one example. Now, those two congregations I mentioned earlier, there was no law except that restraining order that said you cannot do this legally to any of the people involved. People took advantage of the rights that they said they had within our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The leadership eventually in both congregations had to step in and explain to the people involved that the health of the congregation was more important than the rights of any one individual. Let me repeat that. They had to step in and say to the people involved that the rights of the congregation, of the health of the congregation, were more important when it all came down to it, than just one person. What was right was different than their rights. The understanding what was right, or you might say wise or correct, was the difference between that middle way between here's the law and here's free will, or here's individual, whatever we want to do. Now, that middle way, according to Riddell, is manners and obedience to the unenforceable. Okay, so how could that middle way apply to you here? Well, first of all, let me say a caveat. There is no fellowship legal code here. We do not expect a Unitarian Universalist good manners police to arrive and cite us if we disagree with each other. That's not going to happen. Nor does this congregation, as far as I can tell, currently have the other extreme of individual liberty and rights that cause unhealthy relationships within the community. So you're away from both of those patterns right now. What I have proposed to the board and the transition team, and now to you, is that we create a simple and transparent process to mediate disagreements or situations where that middle way of understanding is somehow threatened. The first step will be for the transition team to take this unison affirmation and write a draft statement on how it can be expressed in daily life. So when we say to serve one another, to help one another, to dwell together in peace, what does that really mean? Beautiful words, but what does it mean when the going gets tough, when we're challenged? Now, here's an example from the Yakima Washington Church where I was before here. They'd had a very conflicted situation with a minister who resigned fairly suddenly. It was not a pretty picture. They decided to write up a healthy relations covenant. Interestingly enough, they had a self-proclaimed matriarch who was absolutely furious at the minister leaving and was taking it out on everyone. Their healthy relations covenant said this, right here. We promise to treat each other with kindness, to celebrate each other's spiritual growth, to speak to each other with courage and humility, to listen deeply to each other, and to share our congregational ministry. They shared this draft statement with the congregation over several months on Sundays and focus groups. So that's a part of a relational covenant. It puts it down right into clear language. We promise to listen deeply. We promise to speak with courage and humility, etc. Now, the problem is, and this comes to the second point, is they were still working out a way to make that be restored when it was threatened. It needs to be a fair and transparent and simple process where disagreements and conflicts can be discussed impartially and without a lot of passion. What I've suggested to the transition team is that they and I come up with such a process. Our office administrator, Julie Craig, will also be involved as an advisor because that woman has a heck of a lot of wisdom. And she's also has great skills and experience working in the academic and corporate worlds. She, as an outsider, can probably give some good insights about how to make this happen. So that's one thing we're going to do. Now, you'll notice that I use the term spiritual practice in the title of the sermon. Why? Because we are, believe it or not, a religious community, first and foremost. Spiritual practice is part of what we do and what we try to become more so over time. So how could this process of a relational covenant be a spiritual practice? Well, a few of you know that 2 months ago, I had to take advanced interim training in Virginia. It was nearly a week, and there were 7 of us. And it sounds like, the old joke about going into a bar. There were 2 Presbyterians and 2 Lutherans, United Church of Canada, and a Congregationalist, and me. And it was great. And the Interim Ministry Network is what trains us to do the work we do. Now, the next step in that process after we finished was to do field work, a field study of some sort. And I decided, I've got the perfect situation. How can a relational covenant, aka from this book, be created and succeed in a faith community? Because everybody loves that term, faith community. How can it succeed without a higher power, a scripture, or a God to make it work? I mentioned this to the Christian ministers, and they were astonished. They could not imagine how it could possibly work. So you know what? I'm going to prove how it works. And you know how I'm going to prove it? Because you're going to prove it. Because I believe the answer is that we're going to rely on our inherent understanding of ethics, wisdom, and compassion out of our 6 sources. Because those, if we have any scripture, it's those. I do not believe that we need one scripture, one God, if any, or even the higher power of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston to succeed in a relational covenant. And I am determined to be correct in this one. That's one reason. That's one part of spiritual practice of reconnecting, because that's what spiritual practice is. The second reason is that the people who come up and read your unison affirmation and invite you to say it along with them are your children and youth. When I saw that the first time, I went, whoa, these people know what they're doing. That's one reason why the spiritual practice of politeness and manners is important. Because don't we want to show our children how to be polite and how to resolve conflict when politeness goes away? We have to be examples for them. So I asked Meg MacArthur, who's back in the nursery because she just can't retire, how did we start with this unison affirmation? This is what she wrote to me in part. We've used that version as long as I can remember in RE. 20-some odd years ago, we used to have all the classes meet for a short worship with joys and sorrows and maybe a short story. We used that version of the unison affirmation, and then somebody made a wall hanging with the words. Wow, 23 odd years ago. Now here we are, a generation later. Our children know the unison affirmation covenant by heart. We should as well. And maybe what we also need to do here is deliver its promise for them and for us and for everyone who's going to walk through that door in the next generation. So that's what I think. How about you?
For a while, Barbara Stanky, who used to be a member here, and I babysat, I guess, the teens on a Wednesday night homework study program. And they, of course, knew the covenant and were constantly appalled that the adults didn't follow it. And, and we had to say, well, that's a goal to follow. You can't expect perfection from adults. But they were really appalled at our behavior.
I'm Janet Marsh, and I just wanted to say that I'm just so delighted with what you've said this morning, because I felt, we were talking in the past, in the last year and a half, that we would go through this process of covenant development. And to some extent, I think that's wonderful to get together and figure things out. On the other hand, to me, we have some wonderful basis to start from, and so we don't have to have a lot of angst, I don't think, over what it's going to be. Look at what we have and then flesh it out, as you said.
How many members of the transition team are here? Paula, you're here. And Wayne, what's your name over there? And Pat. And Kathy's not here, and we have one other person. Oh, Dick. How could I forget Dick Danforth? Well, it's not easy to do, actually. So these are the folks along with Julie, Craig, I hope, who will take part in fleshing out what that document means. It's a beautiful unison affirmation, but as somebody said, it's a lot of pretty words. Does it really work? Because you're going to be challenged, you know that. So you might as well work on it now. So the plan is, that what I'm suggesting is for the transition team and Julie and I to work on it. We take it to the board, and they work with it, and then we do focus groups so that you can work with it too. And then maybe by May, when you have your congregational meeting, you can vote on it. See if it's workable. And it always changes. I mean, a year from now, you may say, nah, we don't need that. But it's good to put it in place. Any other comments? And by the way, I think that Lean on Me is from the supplemental hymnal. So we may need to have those passed out. Hint, hint.
Hi, I'm Karen Heapel. And I just want to say, Alex, I'm finding it fascinating sitting here listening with my political theorist brain that the whole idea of that inner space in between those two dichotomies of manners is very much an Enlightenment idea of Montesquieu. Anybody who's read their Montesquieu in the Spirit of the Laws. This is the Enlightenment idea that man can make himself better than the beasts and improve himself and improve the world and create something more than just the wildness of nature through manners. And what you're saying also is that we can go one step beyond that and we can make manners a mindful spiritual practice and make it something yet more than that. And I find that really fascinating and exciting.
Thank you.
I'm Ellie, and I just wanted to say that I like the idea of going through this process for my own relationships and also looking at the political situation with the relationships in Congress. And I think we all need to go through this and look at it as something that's beyond just these walls.
Thank you.